Welcome to Thursdays for the Soul. This is a webinar series which is consistent every week to care for the whole church. Our topics are wide-ranging and we focus on the spirituality and the care of people. There's prayer, worship, music, psalm readings, or compassionate teachings, and we are predictable at this time every week. I want to introduce to you today your host, Reverend Dr. Aaron Wade, who is a dear friend and colleague, and you may know him through his work on granting and support for congregations impacted by COVID-19, or through his work in Washington, D.C. on the front lines of justice and in church planting through the community church in Washington, D.C. And today's topic is, Aaron?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Chris said, what is the title of this section? We're looking at caring for Black souls during and post national racial trauma. Essentially, what that means is we're looking at the mental impact of national racially charged occurrences that have happened in these United States, the impact that it has mentally on Black folk, on African Americans here in this United States. We will also be reflecting on Juneteenth, which is tomorrow. And this webinar will explore African Americans' experience of racialized trauma in America. Practitioners we have here with us today will provide recommendations. They'll provide tools and resources for how to walk with Black parishioners in healing from racial trauma. In this conversation, we look to explore how African Americans' unique and shared experiences and best practices can inform us all about how to be a more inclusive place and creating a just world for all. What I would like to do to start off is just look at, when we say trauma, how are we defining trauma? We're using the Oxford Dictionary as our landing place, and trauma is expressed as a one-sentence definition: a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. It shows up in three ways. The first way is an acute trauma resulting from a single incident. Second is chronic trauma. It's a trauma that is repeated and prolonged, such as domestic violence or abuse, something that happens consistently over time. And then there's this type of trauma called complex trauma. It's exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive and interpersonal nature. And so with our practitioners on the line today, we're going to talk about the three different types and how it manifests, how it shows up for African Americans that are experiencing racially charged traumas occurrences here in the US. So without any further ado, I want to go right into introducing our panel so that we can get started with this insightful conversation today. The first person that I want to introduce to us is Reverend Dr. Christine Wiley. Reverend Dr. Christine Wiley is Pastor Emeritus of Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C. She has a private practice in D.C., and she is also an adjunct professor at Howard University's School of Social Work. Pastor Chris.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here today, and I am looking so forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Pastor Christine Wiley. The next panelist we have is the Reverend Dr. Sherry Molock. Reverend Dr. Sherry Molock is co-pastor with her spouse, Guy Molock, of the Beloved Community Church, which is located in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., Acute, Maryland in particular. She is an associate professor at George Washington University. Would you like to say hi to the folks, please, Reverend Sherry?
Hello, greetings, and so glad to be, pardon me, so glad to be here and look forward to our discussion also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Sherry Molock, for being with us. We also have Bishop Rainey Cheeks. Bishop Cheeks is an author and senior pastor of Inner Light Ministry, United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C. And he's also the founder of Inner Light Ministry, a subsidiary of Inner Light Ministries. He's also a grief counselor. Would you like to say hi to everyone, please, Bishop?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you.
Thank you, Bishop. So nice and simple. We also have with us the Reverend Dr. Velda Love. Now, many folk know her as she's a national staff member. She's the Minister of Racial Justice with our Ministry of Justice and Local Church Ministry. And would you like to say hi to the folk, please, Reverend Doctor?
I would love to do that. Good afternoon. It's good to be with you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Last but certainly not least, we have Reverend Dr. Kenneth Samuel, who is the senior pastor of Victory for the World Church located in Georgia, Stone Mountain, Georgia. He is also an adjunct professor at Lancaster Theological Seminary. He's an author as well. Reverend Dr. Samuel, would you like to say hi to everyone who's viewing? Reverend Dr. Kenneth Samuel, are you there? All right, we'll have our tech team to check out what's happening with Reverend Dr. Samuel. We see your picture, but we don't hear you audibly. So we're gonna go on, but as soon as we know that you're here, I'll be looking forward to make sure you get to say hi to everyone who is tuning in. Are you there?
I'm here.
All right, would you like to say hi to the people, please, Reverend Doctor?
Oh, hello, everybody. It's good to see your faces, and happy pre-Juneteenth to everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samuel. All right, without any further ado, let's go right into talking about this conversation. Let's have some in-depth conversation. So we know that throughout history, trauma comes up through crisis events. And so I want to take a contextual look at how African Americans have been impacted here in these United States and beyond throughout the diaspora from racially charged occurrences. How have we been traumatically traumatized? How have folks been traumatized? It shows up in different ways. And if I could, I would show a clip that you could find in your chat for those who are on this Zoom with us live. There's a link that shows a young boy who was playing basketball. And while he's dribbling the ball, he identifies a cop coming in a car. This young man hides behind a truck as the cop goes past, out of fear for his life, I'm assuming, out of being scared. But something happens there. And this suggests that there's something that causes this young man to be fearful of police. And so with that in mind, I want us to look at what some of the history has been and how trauma shows up for Black folks in different ways. Dr. Love, would you please help us with giving us some context?
Yes, thank you so much. And I do this work out of a sense of being African-centered people. And that we are people of African descent. And I want to go back a little bit before we get traumatized, because that has not always been our experience. And when we look at the map of human migration, we know that our people ventured out of Africa some 60 to 70,000 years ago. We are the first peoples. And we get our history interrupted when European colonizers they're looking for labor, they're looking for riches, and they also venture into the interior as well as the exterior of the continent. And so when they make this decision through the papal bull, which is complicit with the Christian church, to dehumanize the African body and then explore the continents, we get this the beginning of this traumatization through the Middle Passage. And we have the diaspora that is spread across the globe. But when we get specific enough into the 1600s, 1619, when the White Lion shows up and the first Africans disembark in Comfort Point, Virginia. So it's about 20 or so odd Africans who are exchanged for food. And we get to this moment in 1636, where we have the first police force, and they are called the Night Watch, and they are watching the bodies of these African descendant people. We get to 1640, and we get more traumatized by being surveilled and watched. And we come with a sense of resistance in our DNA. And so a few of these Africans escape. And when they are caught, they are whipped 30 times a piece. I believe it's 3 of them that leave. So the trauma starts to build the moment these first Africans leave the White Lion. We get to another space. We get to 1669, then we move through casual acts of killing the enslaved. And I call the enslaved because we're born free and That's my particular language. We also have this moment in the Stone Rebellion where a literate, enslaved Congolese warrior in South Carolina organizes an uprising against whites that result in 25 colonists and 35 to 50 Africans being killed. This is the Stone Rebellion, and it was the largest revolt in the British colonies. So not only are we separated from our families, our children, we're segregated and then subjected to the Negro Law. And this Negro Law comes about on April of 1740, also after the Stone Rebellion. And so the enslaved are forced to leave the US. They have no food, no money, but they are beginning to have a sense that their lives, their Black bodies are in danger. So we move through this history and we want to ask the question, how did we get here? We got here through white supremacy. We got here through ratified amendments. We got here through the Dred Scott decision. We got here when the Ku Klux Klan began terrorizing communities in the South. We got here in the summer of 1919 when riots broke out and Black veterans returned from World War I, and police began to use violence, and white lynch mobs began lynching Black bodies. We got here in 1955 when 14-year-old Emmett Till was kidnapped and tortured, wrapped in barbed wire and thrown into the Tallahatchie River in Money, Mississippi. We got here in 1961 when Bull Connor, along with the Ku Klux Klan, began to conspire and attack freedom riders. We got here in 1963. And after the I Have a Dream speech, and whites began to think that this was a horrible space for us, the Negro, to speak out and demand human rights. We got here in 65, we got here in 1992, we got here with the killing of Amadou Diallo, when the officers acquitted on all charges of killing him at the age of 23. We got here through Sean Bell, who was shot by New York police officers, 50 rounds of ammunition, traumatizing not only Sean Bell's family, but the people that witnessed this murder. We got here in February 2012 when 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was stalked by George Zimmerman and shot and killed over being a Black young boy. We also got here when Raquel Boyd was shot and the officers there were acquitted. We got here in 2014 when Michael Brown was shot and killed. We got here when Ahmaud Arbery was followed. We got here when Breonna Taylor was sleeping in her home. We got here when George Floyd was lynched with a knee on his neck. That kind of trauma is generational, it is triggering, it is dangerous, and it is violent.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Love, for really laying that out for us and painting the picture for how trauma has been passed down generationally. I think something to add to that I would love to say is the fact that most of the things that you listed were public occurrences. Mm-hmm. It happened in communities. Folks saw it on TV screens or folk heard about it. So it happened publicly and it was a message, maybe unintentional, but it was a message that went to African Americans. The second thing, outside of it being a public occurrence, is that in many of these cases, the lack of legal accountability or justice for the victims was present. Folk walked away, folk that hung, lynched, folk that did various things, they got off without being charged, and that was also amplified publicly. Those two things, the public lynching and brutality, as well as the public acquittal of folk who we know, we seen with cameras walk away that declared as innocent, that does something to the minds of people, especially to the people that see themselves as the person that was victimized. And so with that in mind, I want to explore a question around how does trauma show up for African Americans during and post racial events that happen nationally? And with that, how do you identify if you've been traumatized? You know, we talked about complex trauma. Sometimes you think that complex trauma, this is just the way of life. This is what happens to me. So you may not know it, may not recognize the symptoms. And so, Sherry, Reverend Dr. Molock, if you could help us with just unpacking that a little bit. How does it show up in general for folk, in particular African Americans? And then how can I, if I want to know if I've been traumatized from seeing the stuff, especially most recently happening, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the things that are graphically we've watched on cameras. How do I know if I've been traumatized by this?
Thank you. I also want to thank Dr. Love for providing with that really rich context. So I think when you listen to what she was talking about and your recent comments, what you see is that we definitely have prolonged racial traumatizing experiences. So I liked your earlier definition where you said they were acute and then there are prolonged. And right now is a kind of a kairos moment in our history because we are experiencing acute trauma with the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're also experiencing the highlighting, not the newness of it. This is not a novel thing we're just realizing all of a sudden, but it's just being highlighted how prolonged racial injustice is. And then we also have a person I call the occupant in the current on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, who with his rhetoric has given people open permission and license to not even try to hide racial injustice, not to even hide racist thoughts and premises, not even we don't need to figure out how to not codify it or codify it in a way that's hidden. It's really open now. And so in some ways it's always been there, but in some ways it's more traumatizing just because it's in your face all the time. And I think that part is really, really, really challenging. I think also we have to look at, for this kind of racial injustice to be so highlighted in the context of we had 8 years of our first African-American president, I think to be honest with you, some of us are shocked. People unfortunately believe mistakenly that we were in a post-racial culture where things were better. And so to have that kind of backlash after having 8 years of a president who looked like us, understood us, spoke our language, and affirmed and embraced us is really, really traumatizing as well. So how do people know that they're experiencing trauma? I think one of the things that's really hard for Black folks is that we are so exposed to trauma that we sometimes, quote unquote, normalize it. What I mean by that, we don't recognize trauma for what it is. We particularly don't recognize that we're experiencing trauma. So trauma can come up in a lot of different ways. And I want to make sure we differentiate between something that's called acute stress versus post-traumatic stress, which I think a lot of people have heard about. So when you have acute stress, what we're talking about is, it's like PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's shorter and it comes up more suddenly. So an example that would be having a lot of fear around COVID-19, fear of getting sick, fear of loved ones, which is real. So I don't want to in any way suggest that it's not, but it's a fear that something really bad or disastrous is going to happen. Now, also, we need to understand that what's happening in the Black community with COVID-19 is not about race. It's also about racial injustice. The reason why we are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 is because of racial and social injustice, not because there's something inherent in our DNA that makes us have COVID-19 or have more negative consequences to it. Then there's a disorder called PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and it has 4 basic groups of symptoms. One is intrusive memories, so flashbacks, nightmares. You have emotional distress when something reminds you of the event. I know I have 3 young adult children. All 3 of them get really nervous when police officers ride behind them. They're not doing anything wrong, but there's such an association with police brutality and police officers that their immediate reaction to that, their visceral reaction, is to get tense about that. So that's an example of an intrusive memory. And with PTSD, people have post-traumatic stress disorder, not necessarily because they personally experienced something. They could have witnessed something, or something could have happened to a loved one. So you can also get it from that. The other symptom is avoidance. So people will do things to try to avoid the event, avoid people or situations that you associate with the trauma. So for example, if you don't feel comfortable going out at night by yourself anymore because you're afraid that something bad might happen to you, you might get pulled up by yourself. Negative changes in your thinking and your mood. So being pessimistic, you may feel detached from family members or friends, a sense of hopelessness, helplessness. Sometimes people have changes in their emotional reactions. They're either startled very easily, always on guard, can have problems with sleeping or concentrating, might be irritable. Symptoms of depression are not uncommon. People also sometimes self-medicate. So you may be engaging in habits which are not necessarily healthy for you, but are soothing in the immediate sense. Alcohol abuse, drug use, even sex, using sex to kind of soothe yourself constantly, making bad decisions about how you choose your partners. So those are all signs of PTSD and stress.
Thank you so much, Reverend Molock, for giving us that. I got a question for the panel at large, following up with how we look at, how we identify PTSD and stress. Has anyone, because does anyone else, can anyone else add to that? How have you seen PTSD, stress, trauma show up? Maybe it's a personal account, or maybe it's something that you've seen. Most of us are pastors. You've seen with congregants or things like that without giving names. But is there ways, have you seen stress, trauma, PTSD show up physically manifested?
Yeah, I will add a little bit to that. I was walking down the street the other day with a friend, and a police car came by. We heard the siren, and he just froze. And I looked over at him. I said, "You okay?" And he said, "Whoa." He said, "I just had a flashback." And I said, "What's going on?" And he laughed and said, "You know, a black man and a siren don't go together." And then he started to remind me of the incident, that several that he's had with the police, and one that we were actually together. And then he started talking about how the virus here reminded him also of the AIDS epidemic that we had gone through. And so it was like all of it hitting him at the same time. And I looked at him, I said, "Take a deep breath, just take a deep breath and let it go." And he said, "How do you live through this craziness?" And I said, "You know, I understand, but it does, it flashes back. And when I'm out, I actually work with teaching young people, like when the police stop you if you're driving, I had to tell my son, don't reach in your pocket. Get your ID out before they come to the car. Try not to make any sudden moves. Keep your hands where they can see them. I mean, it's crazy, but you have to teach young people how to respond if the police stop you. And don't buy into if they try to agitate you. Stay calm in the situation. And, you know, to grow up like that and to live through that, it's it hits me often. If one time we were driving and we were in Virginia and the police just came up behind us, and I said, "Be prepared to get stopped, everybody." And they said, "What?" I said, "Police is behind us right now." And sure enough, when we turned off, he followed us, and everybody just had the IDs in their hand before he got to the car, because you just never know.
Thank you for sharing that, Bishop. Does anyone else want to share?
I have 3 young adult children, and at some point, particularly my son, has been stopped so many times. And I remember telling him recently, even though he knows how to handle that, what makes me really sad is that it's normal to him. And I was telling him, I know you have to know how to handle yourself, and I know what you're doing is to keep yourself safe. But on the other hand, it breaks my heart that this is normal to you. I don't want you to normalize this, because when you do that, you're basically saying that what's happening to you is okay, and that it should happen, and it shouldn't. And so I said to him, you know, we need to work on ways for you to feel righteous anger, because this shouldn't happen to you. And we shouldn't, I was just telling them all 3 of them the other day, because they're grown, that if they're out late to text me, and they're 29, 27, and 25, and they're looking at me, and I said, you know what, it'll just give me peace of mind. Because if you're out and you don't come back home, I don't know what that means.
I was recently talking to a friend about the Emmanuel shooting 5 years ago and around that anniversary. And it was just, the conversation was how fearful we were to be in church and being assaulted, murdered for praying and worshiping. And just the trauma that set up. I mean, the blood pressure went up, the conversation got very quiet, but it was the reality. For a while, we had to have security in the church and we had to have escorts to our cars. And we were just leery of white people in general, but particularly young white men. It was like that when Charlottesville happened. So every time that there is an incident where our Black bodies have been murdered and assaulted, there's this reaction that causes the blood pressure to go up. You might not want to leave the house. You might not want to be in those spaces where white people inhabit. And it's not that it's their space, but they're dangerous. They become the dangerous one. And so I think that is the response that my friends and I have talked about, in the way in which we've responded or not gone into spaces so that we remain safe and alive.
I would just add to that and say that I think the trauma shows up in the internalization of violence in the Black community itself. I'll even take it back to the way I was raised. I was raised in a generation where we received corporal punishment. In other words, we got beat by my mother, who loved us all very dearly. And I asked her when I got older, why was she such a physical disciplinarian? Why didn't she just talk to us? And her response was, I thought I had to beat you as a Black man because I didn't want the police to beat you. And I don't think that she was singular in that perspective. I think when we look at the Black on Black crime, I think that itself is symptomatic of a society that is steeped in violence. And as someone has already mentioned, we have seen Black lynchings across the centuries with no reprisal. We live in a gun culture. Stand your ground. I receive online information on how to register for gun ownership. So when we have to talk to people about being nonviolent and being civil, there's a direct contradiction in terms of how violence is so prevalent in society itself. America wants everybody to have a gun except if you're Black. A gun in the hand of a white person is stand your ground. It's freedom. A gun in the hand of a Black person is license to kill. And I think that that contradiction and dichotomy plays into the violence that we often see perpetrated by Blacks against other Black people. And that's not to justify it. It is to say that we are living with double messages in America concerning violence and guns. And it makes it very difficult to have a consistent theology, a consistent practice concerning guns and violence. There's a sweet mother in my church, as sweet as she can be, 80-something years old, who packs a pistol every time she comes to church. I couldn't believe it when I found out. And I asked her about it, and she said, well, listen, Pastor, we are in Stone Mountain, Georgia. She said, and I was raised here where the KKK used to ride through. She said, so I love Jesus, I love my church, and I come praying, but I also come packing, because if anything jumps off, I'm gonna be ready. That's the dichotomy we live with.
Wow, wow, wow. I think you all, the stories that you're sharing helps to paint this picture that it's a big issue and that it's real and that it's not something fabricated. It's a real life, and it becomes the way of life so often for folk to live and operate in a traumatic state, traumatized state. Let's look at this. We know that when we look at trauma, that there are many tenets, there are many things that add to what makes the bubble, the cloud of trauma. One of those things is grief. And so I want to explore, how does grief connect to trauma? Folks may not see the linkage. So I want to, let's look at how that happens. What is grief? What is traumatic grief? What are mental health problems that African Americans face amid right now, the coronavirus and George Floyd, due to grief? And so I'm going to ask Pastor Wiley, if you would speak to this for me, please.
Okay. You know, all of what you've been talking about and all of this trauma is really unsettling. You know, when we talk about it, it even starts to give us some sense of stress, even just talking about it. But looking at grief, that really is a normal process. I mean, it can happen to everyone. It includes physical, social, behavioral, psychological, and spiritual reactions to the loss of a person, or a thing, or a situation. Everybody experiences it after a loss, even though people show it differently. And the process of grief really reshapes our inner world after a loss. Really experiencing rather than avoiding feelings is really necessary. Now, when we think about traumatic grief, that really has a different tone to it. A profound emotional trauma and separation distress, it's suffered after the death of a loved one, but it usually occurs when the death is sudden, unexpected, preventable, or violent. And it really just shatters the bereaved person's worldview. When we think of those persons that we see on television whose families are there with tears in their eyes, and they're still really just suffering as they are being interviewed and still experiencing trauma in the moment. And these traumatic losses are extremely difficult to absorb. And they're almost always accompanied by symptoms of PTSD. As Dr. Molock has given us some of those symptoms, and also, you know, just starting to detach from others and maybe having nightmares and insomnia and just a real lack of motivation, anger, and feeling jumpy, and memory loss, and even just turning to some ways to soothe themselves in terms of drugs and alcohol. But then when we look at you know, this time of the coronavirus and all of these deaths, George Floyd, and then the listing of people who have been killed by police, then we see that there is a real collective trauma. And so, you know, recently there was a survey by the Census Bureau, and they have determined that African Americans have higher rates than any other group of mental health problems and difficulty and trauma during these times. And that means with anxiety and depression and not being able to sleep. And it really just takes an emotional and a mental toll on us as African Americans. And just think about all of the things that have happened, you know, during coronavirus, remaining in the workplace, that brings people stress. And then the effects of unemployment on our people, and just the stress and the grief every day. And then when we saw the knee on George Floyd, and seeing this played on our televisions over and over and over again. It feels like it's happening to you over and over again. And it kind of makes you hyper vigilant, or there can be emotional numbing and secondary trauma, because it could have been us, or it could have been someone that we loved.
Wow, that's really powerful. And I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. But in the latter part of what you were saying, I thought about how I definitely, when I saw the knee on George Floyd's neck, I said, that could have been my brother. That could have been me. That could have been. And so, and then that caused me to be sad. And, you know, folk who work with me, I shared how I wasn't well. I wasn't at my best, you know, during the time when that immediately happened, because I felt like I lost a loved one. I felt like I lost a family member. And then I remember tuning into some of the services for George Floyd. And I remember how there were so many people there that were not family members, who were not public figures, but folk who wanted to come and grieve and mourn and to reflect at the funeral. And I thought about how oftentimes funerals are personal matters. It's for the families, for folk who knew or were in close proximities. But we all felt as if we knew or had some connection because of this corporate grief that I think folk displayed and felt. So thank you for that, Pastor Chris Thing Wiley. I want to let folk know that if you're watching, you can put questions in the chat section. If you want to ask questions to the practitioners, you may have some things that you're thinking, well, how does this relate? Can I, you know, what can I do? This is where you can put questions, and I will ask those questions to those who are listed here on the panel. Let's just jump in and let's talk about, so we've painted the picture for how, the context for how Black folk, African-American folk have experienced trauma, corporate trauma throughout the diaspora. We talked about how grief is connected, and we also looked at the various ways that we experience trauma. Now, I think it's imperative, since we're talking about caring for, that we look at how do we create healing environments? What are some recommendations for caregivers, partners, folk who want to be there for folk? How do we create healing environments? And what are some tools and recommendations for doing that? Bishop Cheeks, can you help us with that?
Yes. I have to tell you, I was having a little flashback when you were speaking just now, because I've been arrested twice, and that knee in the back is what they do all the time. And I can't remember the young man's name. Remember the one that they handcuffed and they put him in the back and he ended up paralyzed? Because when they put you in the back of the truck, there's nothing to hold on to. And they purposely turn corners hard to knock you around in the back of the truck. Yeah, self-care is so important. And I will say, especially for those of us in ministry and those in the profession of taking care of other people. And I put self-care in 5 categories. One is physical, one is emotional, one is social, one is spiritual, and one is professional. We have to take time out to take care of ourselves in all of these categories. And the one thing I find with a lot of folks is they have problems with the word no. And I've learned that no is the equal opposite of yes. So when you didn't ask me why when I said yes, don't ask me why when I say no. Sometimes I got to pull back from everything just so that I can stay sane in the process. And I think that it is so important for all of us in this profession, especially when we spend so much energy taking care of other people or listening to other people, that we also are able to take care of ourselves. Physically, is like, are you eating healthy? Are you getting enough sleep? I was going through something recently, and when I talked to a friend of mine and she said, Rainey, you know the answer. And I said, something was going on with me. I'm a person with low blood pressure. I'm a Black man, not with high blood pressure, but low blood pressure. And she said, I know you know the answer. And I said, I'm in the middle of the forest and I can't see trees. And she said, are you sleeping 8 hours? And I said, not really. She said, there's number one. You're not sleeping enough. You need to be in bed for 8 hours, and you know this. And sometimes just little things like that slip away from us and we're not paying attention to it. Emotionally, just taking time for yourself. I was thinking the other day, I said, I got to pick my hobbies back up. I drum, African drumming, and when I'm drumming, I realize I don't talk to anybody. I just, for that hour or so when I'm drumming, I'm in my zone, I'm in my space, and I'm not talking to anybody. I used to play a lot for dance classes. But you got to find ways that you constantly nurture yourself in this process, and because it's so easy for it to slip away from you. And so in those 5 areas, physical, psychological or emotional, social, spiritual, and professional, that you have to constantly look at, are you balanced in those different areas of your life? And it's so easy for one area to slip over to the other area, and you're taking time off in this, but you're not taking time off from that. I found myself in a trap one time because I would call myself taking a vacation, but I was taking a vacation only in one area of my life, but still functioning in the same rhythm in the other areas of my life. So now I realize when I take a vacation, I have to stop everything and just have myself, my time, that I'm not Bishop Cheeks, I'm not Reverend Cheeks. I'm around people that I can just be Rainey. And then Rainey can do other things. I was on a vacation one time and somebody recognized me and they said, Bishop? I said, no, Bishop's at home. Rainey is here. Bishop's at home. Because I didn't want to go into gear. In fact, I got invited. I'm on a vacation and I got invited to, somebody saw me, invited me to their worship service. And I love this old lady, the grandmother leaned over to me and said, baby, are you on vacation? I said, yes, ma'am. She said, don't you show up. I said, thank you. Thank you. And so we need to be able to, in each area of our life, find healthy ways to take care of ourselves, because it's so easy to burn out in doing this work. And I know that everybody here have some things that you can jump in there and throw in there. So
that's exactly what I was going to ask folk. Are there any other recommendations? We have a question that's in the chat that said, so with being socially isolated, socially distant, how do we care for our folk who are experiencing trauma, but we can't get to them? So we can't offer hugs, we can't offer, physical things. What can we do? So let's add to this by saying, what are some other things? And then how can we do it in the situation that we find ourselves in today?
I think we are blessed to have all this technology. We're on it right now, right? We're connecting with 152 people right now. And so yes. For those of you who don't like technology, get over it. Go online, get YouTube, Google something. YouTube is great because they'll show you step by step. You can see people doing it. So we have our worship services online every Sunday. We have done 3 funerals online. We have a stress management workshop every week. We have a book club. We are more together at the Beloved community with the pandemic than we were before it. And I think part of that is because we don't have competing activities going on. We have people with young children, for example, they don't have school plays and sports anymore. But also people are really intentional now and very purposeful about the importance of us staying connected because we cannot get together. We don't take staying connected for granted anymore, and I think we used to do that. So there are lots of creative ways. I was typing in there as you were talking, Bishop. Do a drive-by. I've seen people do drive-bys with balloons once a week and coordinate that. We have people coordinating, attending graduations for our young people. Do a drive-by, drop some balloons by, deliver some food. And those are things you can do and still do in a safe way. Keep your mask on, keep your gloves on, keep your hand sanitizer in the car, but you can do that. So I think it's one of the gifts of the church, the body of Christ, is that we help people hold on by staying connected. And that's more powerful than a lot of other things we can even do therapeutically sometimes. So that's really important to think about, ways you can stay connected.
And we have a thing that I start off each meeting now with somebody has to tell a joke. And they were like, "Are you kidding?" I said, "Nope, the meeting can't start unless the joke come after the prayer. There has to be a joke." And I said, "I don't care, clean, dirty, or silly. You have to tell a joke." And it's been some of the craziest jokes in the world that have come across. And you got to find a way to keep laughing through this, and encouraging each other. And you're right, the technology has been a blessing because you can still at least see people and connect to people. And we do have a team that go out individually and maybe stop in on somebody to make sure they're okay. But yeah, the technology, if I can use technology, anybody can use technology. I think that is more like push a button and wait and see.
Thank you, Bishop. Reverend Dr. Love.
Yeah, I miss going to the Caribbean. That was my way of going to de-stress because I wanted to be around people of African descent. I wanted to see brown people and Black people, and I wanted to eat the food and I wanted to hear the music. But now that we are in COVID and the reality of COVID, it is the technology. And so my family and I have FaceTime on Sundays. My book club, we get together and we have cocktails and dinner. I'm teaching my godson how to cook. And so we have Friday cooking events. But I think it is, in this moment, the caring for my friends of European descent are calling often and wanting resources, and I love them dearly, and I try to hold them, but it's difficult for me to care for myself when I feel traumatized and overworked, burdened, or lamenting and grieving. I can't care for pretty much everybody else. And I need to tell people I'm taking some days off. I'm turning off technology. I'm going to sit and watch the geese and the birds and the lake. So I have to do that. I think the self-care piece is intentionality, but it's also about saying no. And I am really good at saying no. No technology from Friday to Sunday. And I think that's one of the ways in which I can stop checking emails. And that way it forces people to care for themselves. I have a spiritual director. And so I have my spiritual direction once a month. And so I think the reality is that this has been overwhelming mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And so we have to take care of ourselves if we are going to continue to try to be present with other people.
Thank you, Rev. I hear that at the end of the day, the important piece of stuff is do something that's going to make you smile, that's going to make your heart sing. Take a moment to still away in order to be able to get a little happiness, is what I'm hearing you say. We have a couple of questions here. One of them is, how might the experience of traumatic events impact Black folk differently when living in a community that is 90% white and attending a church that is 99% white with a white pastor? How might that impact folk?
I think that one of the ways, I mean, I kind of grew up that way, unfortunately or fortunately. It really can be a struggle because you don't have a sense of support. Like who can you talk to? I think I was listening to Dr. Love and talking about white colleagues. One of the things I think Black folks, particularly clergy, people who are in academic studies have to be careful of is not allowing white fragility and white guilt have you taking care of everybody but yourself. And sometimes I have to share with my white colleagues that while I want to be supportive of them and I appreciate their being an ally, I also need them to do their own work. I can't do my work and your work too. And so some of them, they have to take ownership of that and responsibility. I think for someone who's in a predominantly white community, find some Black folks, find some people that you can kind of be honest with, let your hair down, talk frankly, because I think sometimes if the people are not open or willing to have a really honest, frank discussion with you, or if they're going to talk about how guilty they feel without ownership about guilt, is not going to help. Shame is not really going to move us forward. And so while I appreciate your sentiments, I really need you to do something. If they're not willing to have that conversation with you, then it's just another burden on you.
I
In
think
addition to that question,
also, yeah, I think also, you know, when you're in environments like that, and the normal thing is that Black people go through implicit bias, they go through microaggressions. And when there is such as what is happening in the country now, really realizing that some of these things are really traumatizing you. And so giving yourself permission to see a mental health person, you know, giving yourself permission to be in counseling with a person of color, or if not a person of color, someone who is astute and knows something about racism and all of that. So I think it's very important because there's quite a stigma in the African American community about counseling and therapy. It's getting better, but you've got to give yourself permission to be able to seek out someone who can really give you some help.
thank you, Pastor Chris. One other question here is, what should a pastor who is white, that have a Black member in a predominantly white congregation, what should they consider when offering pastoral care for these individuals? Can we get one person at least to respond? Okay. Bishop, it looked like you're trying to speak. You might not mute yourself if you are.
Yeah, give me that question again.
What would you recommend for a pastor who has a Black congregant in a predominantly white church, and they are predominantly, what should they be mindful of when providing pastoral care to that individual? Is there anything you would say, hey, keep this in mind?
As everybody's been talking, this is not something that just started. This has been a long history of our people. It is very hard for a white person that may have, I watched a piece the other day, it was Joel Osteen actually with John Gray, and John Gray said to him, I'm glad that you came down and you actually went out and walked with the people, because you have no understanding. You grew up with white privilege, and you need to acknowledge that. And I think that if white pastors can understand that no matter where you grew up, you still have white privilege, and to understand how that white privilege permeates throughout everything that you do. One, be willing to actually listen to the people's stories. Don't say that you know. You wouldn't know that the police has handcuffed me and put me down. When I saw the knee in his back and his neck, I mean, even now, and it's like, I know what that is. And you try not to get angry over it. And you try to find yourself in a healthy space. But even now, that resonates with me. So with a white pastor, if you have Black people in your congregation, be willing to actually sit and listen to some of the stories. Listen to that these are not stories that happened long time ago. This is happening today. The only difference between Floyd and 1,000 other Black men is that his was on tape. And thank God for the young person. I understand the woman that taped it was 17 years old. And that little thing, this little instrument right here has changed the game on a lot. Where it was stories that you heard, now you actually see it. And so I would say to the white pastors, have a day, not doing worship service, have a day that you're willing to sit down and say, talk to me. I need to hear exactly what you're feeling. and then try with as much empathy as you can to relate to what's going on, and then you'll have a better picture.
I see a lot of questions coming through, and I'm so glad people are engaging and asking questions. Let's try to make sure they respond. I'm not going to be able to answer all of our questions in this moment, so I do want to apologize. I do want to apologize about that. We're going to. We only have a few minutes left. What I want to do is be able to ask if self-care too. We talked about self-care. Pastor Sherry will lead us in more self-care tools.
Okay, I hope that you guys can hear me. Aaron, you were a little bit scratchy. So hopefully it's kind of a lot of static. So hopefully people can hear without the static. So this is a meditation. It's a kind of a self-care, what we call mindfulness meditation. And one of the things I'm struck by, that's come up a little bit today, is self-care. And I think it's hard for clergy persons, people in leadership positions, people from every walks of life, to kind of recognize that even in this kind of moment where so much is going on, it's really important to what I call put your mask on first. It's very tempting, particularly those who are in service of others, to want to pour out without recognizing that even Jesus would go off by himself and take a break. He would perform miracles, he would heal people, and then he would go off with the disciples by himself because they need to have some R&R, some rest and relaxation. So I want us to realize that sometimes we have really unrealistic expectations of ourselves. We may not realize how stressed out we are, or we may feel we're not supposed to be stressed, particularly clergy persons in leadership positions, particularly people in the church. You feel like you're supposed to be strong and wise and stoic and measured, and we got all these people depending on us. I don't have time to be stressed out. I don't have time to take a break. And yet, as Reverend Dr. Chris Wiley said earlier, this stuff takes a toll on you mentally, physically, and spiritually. And so what I'm going to ask everyone to do right now, if you could just sort of sit back in your chair and relax. Once you, if you can, close your eyes. If you're crossing your legs, I want you to uncross them and put your hands in your lap. And I want you to take a deep breath in and hold it and blow it out. If you can, breathe in through your nose and breathe out through your mouth. I'm going to be saying hold it, deep breath in and deep breath out, but I want you to breathe at your own pace. You don't have to breathe at my pace. Close your eyes so you can kind of relax your mind. Take a deep breath in, breathe out. Take a deep breath in, hold and breathe out. Now I want you to put your hand on your heart, and I want you to imagine yourself with loving yourself with a lot of compassion as you continue to breathe in, hold and breathe out. When you were a little boy or little girl, probably when you were a baby, there was some time when your mother, your grandmother, your father figure would pat you on the back to kind of put you to sleep or to calm you down. And we're not able to really pat ourselves on our backs, but you can pat yourself on your heart. So I want you to just, as you continue to breathe in and breathe out, I want you to pat yourself on your heart to soothe yourself. Breathe in and breathe out. Now I want you to think of something that you've been struggling with, maybe this week or today, or since the COVID-19 pandemic started. Maybe you're feeling like you can't watch TV anymore because you're afraid you'll hear of another life snuffed out too soon. You can't stand hearing another incident of police brutality, another Black person caught while driving while Black, going to the park while Black, going to Starbucks while Black, breathing while Black. Maybe you've been snapping at people. Maybe you're overeating. Maybe you can't get motivated to do any work. You just want to be a couch potato right now. As you continue to breathe in, hold and breathe out. Thinking about the things that you do to beat yourself up every day. What's the thing you said or did you shouldn't have said or did? The things you should have said or did that you didn't. What are the things that make you angry with yourself? Make you disappointed with yourself? Maybe you're tired of struggling with the same thing over and over again. You thought you were better than that. You thought you'd be over it by now. Now I want you to give yourself a break. Cut yourself some slack. As you continue to breathe in and breathe out, and I want to feel you patting yourself on your heart. I want you to imagine you are having more compassion towards yourself. As you continue to breathe in, hold, and breathe out, continue to pat yourself on your heart as you soothe yourself. Tell yourself that things are kind of rough right now, but that you're not alone. All of us are struggling. There's not a person on the planet who's gone through a COVID-19 pandemic before. You have to remember that while this is our first pandemic, it's not God's. This is not the first time that God has heard the cries of God's people. We are not the first group that God has led out of the wilderness. We are not the first group to have an Exodus experience with God. God is not caught off guard, and God is not overwhelmed by our life circumstances, even if we are. I want you to remind yourself that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Tell yourself that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, that God was delighted when God was just thinking about the idea of creating you, that God was delighted about who you would become, that God loves you with an everlasting love, with a love that cannot be separated by height or depth or principalities or things that are happening in the past, not even things that are going on right now. Nothing can separate you from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus. As you continue to breathe in and out, as you continue to bask in the glow of God's love for you, be mindful that as you love yourself, you are called to love yourself as God loves you, which means that you look beyond your faults and focus on your needs. You look beyond your flaws and see your possibilities. You recognize that you're a work in progress and God is not through with you yet. So you don't need to beat yourself up for your mistakes and your disappointments, be they in yourself or other people, or just a moment in time and not your eternity. As you continue to feel yourself giving yourself compassion, feel yourself fully embrace and love yourself. Feel yourself loving yourself just the way God loves you, fully and completely. You don't have to be anybody else but you. As you continue to breathe in and breathe out, as you prepare to open your eyes on the count of 3 and become fully present, take a deep breath in for the Creator, the one who delights in the creation. Take a deep breath in for the Redeemer, the one who was born, lived, and died, and resurrected so that we could be reconciled back to God. And one final deep breath in for the Sustainer, who promises to be with us through thick and through thin until the Redeemer comes again. Amen. You can open your eyes.
Amen. Thank you so much, Pastor Sherry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pastor Sherry. I really, really appreciate you leading us in that meditation. And I apologize for my technological challenges to those who are listening. This has been an amazing conversation. And I want to thank each one of you for participating and saying yes. Your yes, I pray, is making a difference across this nation, and it's amplifying the urgency of now for so many folk. I want to thank you. A couple of housekeeping matters as we begin to close out this conversation. If this conversation has moved you, if it matters to you, then I would ask that you would donate. Donate to ministries like this. It's real simple. You can text a gift by texting UCC to 41444. Once again, UCC to the number 4144. And this support will help to continue the work like this. It will allow this to continue. Second thing, there are some events that I want to make sure I highlight and invite you to participate in. If you haven't registered, you can. On tomorrow, it's Juneteenth, and we will be having remembrance. We will celebrate and commemorate Juneteenth at noon Eastern Standard Time. There's a webinar that's going on that's being led by our very own Reverend Dr. Velda Love. On Tuesday, we will be speaking about how to fundraise at times like this, featuring Reverend Starksky Wilson, Dr. Susan, and Jacqueline Owens. And then Thursday, we will have Reverend Tracy Howe leading us in a discussion on resilience in remembering, liberation theology, and memory, indignia. I want to thank you all. I want to invite you all to make sure you participate in the webinar series that continues to happen on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The information, you can register, the information goes out on all of our platforms. This moment, let me just say a quick word of prayer. And once again, thank you for tuning in to this particular webinar. Let us humble ourselves before the Creator. And I'm going to ask Dr. Samuels, if you would lead us quickly in prayer.
Gracious God, we are grateful for this time to breathe. We're grateful for this time to reflect. We're grateful for this time to come together. God, we know that in troubled times, we often look for your presence, but you are the God who speaks through the thunder, and yet your eye is still on the sparrow. So in seeing you, help us to see the people that you love. Help us to see ourselves. In Jesus' name, amen.